Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Susie Roop and I work here at Rhodes Scholar. And it is my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture, How the Victorians Made Modern London. These virtual lectures are free and available not just to Rhodes Scholar participants, but they're available for anyone who loves to learn. So spread the word. This series of online lectures is critical to helping us pursue our not-for-profit mission of making learning accessible to as many lifelong learners as we can. That includes those who do not have the physical ability, the financial means, or the option to leave their homes to come join us on a program. Ultimately, this series would not be possible without the support of viewers like you who have funded this project through generous donations. So please consider making a donation to not-for-profit Rhodes Scholar so we can continue to provide educational experiences both in the classroom, virtually, and on our learning adventures around the world in the future. Visit www.rhodesscholar.org/give to show your support with a monetary donation. Every dollar helps. So while the Rhodes Scholar headquarters is based in Boston, we have offices and staff around the world. And today you'll be hearing from Ruth Polling. Ruth is a freelance guide and lecturer specializing in London's history and politics. Having worked in London politics for 10 years, she then graduated top of her year as the London Blue Badge Guide of the Year in 2014. Ruth has been working with Rhodes Scholar on our London-based programs for a little over 6 years now. Before we begin, we have a few quick notes. Ruth will present for approximately 30 minutes, after which we will host a 10-minute question and answer session. During the session, you can submit questions using the question and answer icon located at the bottom of your screen. Afterwards, I'll read a few questions live for Ruth to answer. There are almost 600 of you watching live right now, so apologies if we don't get to your question, but we will certainly try our best to get through as many as possible. Should technical issues force you to miss any portion of this webinar, don't worry. We will be adding a recording of this lecture to our online virtual lecture library. And finally, at the end of the Q&A session and our time here together, you will be prompted to take a very short survey, just like you would on any Rhodes Scholar program. We ask that you please take a few minutes to fill this out because your feedback is immensely helpful to us and will help us grow and improve our virtual lecture series. So without further ado, let's have a warm virtual welcome to Ruth Polling.
Thank you, and well, hello and welcome to this lecture on Victorian London. As Susie said, my name is Ruth and I'm a professional London tourist guide, which basically means in normal times, I have the best job in the world. But of course, this year, I haven't been able to share stories of London with visitors. And so I'm absolutely delighted that Rhodes Scholar have given me this opportunity today to share a little bit of London with you, at least virtually. And I want to do this because London is a truly awe-inspiring city. As you can see from this photograph by Maria Farrelly, it is an enormous city. London is over 600 square miles. It's home to around 9 million people. And the breadth and the depth of its nearly 2,000-year history and its impact on the world makes London such a hugely important and exciting city to visit or visit virtually. It's difficult to know really where to start in terms of telling London's story. Originally founded by the Romans sometime around 47 AD as a port for, let's be honest, a pretty obscure bit of the Roman Empire, London grew to become the largest port in the world, the center of its own empire, which spread its legal and political system worldwide. It grew to become what it is today, a financial and cultural center. And these changes from that obscure port city to the city that you see today happened over a 2,000-year period. But it happened in fits and starts. There were centuries where very little changed. And then there were periods of massive change, of incredibly rapid expansion and development, which really created the city we have today. None of these periods are more important than the Victorian period of the 19th century. When Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, the population of what's now inner London was approaching 1.5 million people. A census was taken in the year of her death, 63 years later in 1901, and central London's population by then was almost 4.5 million people. And London's dramatic growth in the 19th century happened because of the wealth that was flowing into the city. London was the capital of the world's first industrial nation. It was the home of the largest port in the world and of the political and financial institutions of a worldwide empire. London in the 19th century was truly a world centre of finance, trade and industry. Until very recently, London really hasn't looked too hard at this past, and particularly at where the wealth came from. London's only now very tentatively, very slowly starting to confront the appalling cost of the British Empire worldwide. If you visit London today, there are no physical symbols of the fact that London's wealth in the 19th century came from the slave trade and from the exploitation of countries and people worldwide under the British Empire. It's a hugely important story that I think urgently needs to be told. It deserves a lecture in its own right, but it's not the theme of the lecture today. I don't want to look so much at where London's 19th century wealth came from as what the impact of that wealth was on the city itself. How London went from a tiny city with a little bit of outlying development to a truly modern metropolis. Now, we're going to explore the developments that made that happen over the next 25 minutes or so. And we're going to discover how the Victorians truly made modern London. Now, the Victorian era is considered to start in 1837 with the coming to the throne of Queen Victoria. You can see her here outside of her birthplace at Kensington Palace. And so it seems appropriate to start our lecture with a very personal contribution that Queen Victoria made to the developments of Victorian London. You see, within a month of coming to the throne, Queen Victoria decided to relocate to Buckingham Palace. She made it the official residence of the monarch in London, and it's continued in that role right up to the present day. From Buckingham Palace, Queen Victoria really modelled our expectations of modern royalty. She turned Buckingham Palace into a centre of not just state ceremonial, but a home for the idealised Victorian family, with her husband, Prince Albert, and their 9 children. Now, of course, Buckingham Palace needed to be redeveloped in order to fulfill these roles. And in 1847, a new wing was added to Buckingham Palace, the East Wing. Now, though it has been refaced in 1913, so it didn't look exactly like this in 1847, it's that East Wing that millions of visitors see when they come to London every year. This is the famous bit of Buckingham Palace that people come to photograph. And at the centre of it is the balcony, which Queen Victoria was the first monarch to use. Now, Buckingham Palace was further west than the previous official homes of the monarch, but it was still very much in the district of Westminster. And that continued a tradition that dates all the way back to the 11th century of Westminster as a royal capital. Unlike the area known as the City of London, whose importance came from trade and finance, the district of Westminster developed completely separately from the City of London as our centre of government. From the 16th century, the old Palace of Westminster became the regular home of our Parliament as it emerged. On the 16th of October, 1834, disaster struck, because that old Palace of Westminster burnt down in just a few hours. But the destruction of the old building was to provide an amazing opportunity, because the replacement building, started in 1840, was the most famous Victorian building in the world. This is the Palace of Westminster, or Houses of Parliament, and it is of course topped by the very famous clock tower known all over the world as Big Ben. The Gothic style which was chosen for the building, which often makes modern visitors think the building is older than it really is, was very deliberately chosen. It was chosen to look back to the medieval period where our Parliament first emerged. The very architecture of this building is expressing this narrative of continuity of British history. It's expressing the desires of the ruling class in the 19th century to see Britain as this home of parliamentary democracy. Of course, in 1840, that democracy was strictly limited to the very small percentage of the male population who could actually vote. But that in itself was to change during the Victorian period. There were big extensions to the franchise in 1867 and 1884. In a terrifyingly fast-changing world, the past really provided a reassurance to the Victorians who had the power to shape how the city was developing. The Industrial Revolution had created unprecedented social upheaval. And so you get this conflict between looking back to the past, to an age of chivalry, of craftsmanship, but also driving forward, embracing this industrial age and confronting the social change that that brought. And this conflict is a recurring motif in Victorian thought. The Victorians used other architectural styles which also look to the past, most notably the neoclassicism that's used in our government district in buildings like this one here. But Gothic or Neo-Gothic is the dominant architectural style of the era. And it had a really profound effect on the look of the developing metropolis, not just in the centre of government, but out in the newly developing suburbs. New churches and civic buildings built for these suburbs adopt that Gothic style to give themselves a sense of history. I mean, this building is, by London standards, not very old, but it's got that Gothic history attached to it. The world's most modern city in the 19th century was looking backwards as well as looking forwards. Now, while the buildings changed, and actually the scope of Parliament and government massively changed in the 19th century, Westminster's essential role didn't. Westminster had been the centre of government since the 11th century, and that continues in the Victorian period, the centre of royalty, of government, of Parliament. And the Victorians, by choosing historical styles for their grand building projects, give Westminster this feeling of continuity, which affects how we still see Westminster today. Early Victorians, however, wouldn't actually have considered Westminster to be part of London. Because London wasn't this whole sprawling area that you can see on the map. Westminster is down in this corner here. And in 1837, the area known as the City of London was just 1 square mile. It's marked in red on the map, but it's actually quite difficult to see. So I'm just using the pointer just to show that square mile there. The area originally settled by the Romans in 47 AD. Now, unlike Westminster, the City of London was to see a very profound change in the 19th century. In 1837, the City of London really was a city in its own right. It had everything you'd expect of a city. It had industry, it had shops, it had offices, and it had a residential population of about 130,000 people. By 1900, that had dropped to just 27,000 people. Now, this wasn't a new trend in the Victorian era. As London's population had grown from the 16th century onwards, smelly industries had been pushed out to the east of the City of London, taking their workers with them. So that's the development that you can see here to the east of the City of London. From the 17th century, and particularly in the aftermath of the Great Fire of London of 1666, many wealthy Londoners chose not to move back into the overcrowded city, but to move to newly developed suburbs around garden squares in the west, this area here. That trend continued right through the 18th century, and as the residential population moved out in the 18th into the 19th century, their buildings were increasingly taken over as offices of the trading companies, of banks, of insurance firms, and of course of their support services, things like accountants and lawyers. And you can see from this picture that those early offices move into buildings that were very clearly built to be residential properties. This is where Edwin Waterhouse, one of the founders of a company that becomes PricewaterhouseCoopers, worked in this residential building here. But the big development in the 19th century is the building of grand new offices. And these purpose-built offices really display the wealth flowing into the city. And as they consolidate sites to build these offices, that forces out the last of London's residents. It meant that by the end of the 19th century, the City of London was basically what it is today, which is a centre of finance served by a commuting population. Unlike today, however, London in the 19th century wasn't just a financial centre, it was an industrial centre as well. The story of Britain's Industrial Revolution often concentrates on the northern towns and cities, the big factories, the mining industry. It's often forgotten that London itself was an industrial city. What marked London out from other industrial cities was there was no one industry which was dominant. In fact, many of the industries were very small scale. In 1851, 86% of all industrial employers in London had less than 10 employees. Despite that, if you add up all of these small industries, it's a lot of workers. By 1861, London had more industrial workers than the total population of Manchester, thought of as this big northern industrial city. Of course, these industries, big or small, needed space. Now, while there were still industrial sites in the centre of London into the 20th century, most of the space for industry in the 19th century is found to the east of the City of London. And as we've seen, that's a continuation of a trend which had existed at least since the 16th century of pushing smelly industries downriver of the City of London. After the Industrial Revolution, as the scale of industry increases, the land grab to the east gets even bigger. Previously small villages become industrial centres sucked into London's orbit. And these industries needed workers. So London's population increases as its industry increases. These workers couldn't afford to pay to travel into work, so they lived within walking distance of their places of work. East London in the 19th century doesn't simply become an industrial centre, it becomes a home of a whole new industrial working class. A key reason for industry continuing in London, despite the fact the costs were much higher than being based in other parts of the UK, was the port, because that gave London industries ready access to raw materials and to international markets. London had been a port city since its origins, but it's in the 18th century that the trade of the port massively expands. Between 1700 and 1770, the trade of the port doubles. Between 1770 and 1795, it doubles again. And of course, that put a massive strain on the existing port facilities. They desperately needed more space. And the solution to this was new enclosed docks. Now, these docks took up far more space than the old wharves of the old port, and that space is found in the east, downriver towards the sea. As the 19th century opens in 1800, the first enclosed dock was built at West India Dock with the warehouses that accompanied it. And throughout the 19th century, more docks were added. You can see from this map all of the docks that were built in the 19th century. If you ignore just this tiny southern stretch of water, which was built in the 20th century, everything else on here is 19th century, including this dock. This is the Royal Albert Dock, opened in 1880. And when this opened, it was 7 miles from the edge of what had been considered London just 100 years before. So we've seen how the development of the docks pushes London further and further eastwards. But it's the development of a public transport infrastructure which turns London from a small city into a true metropolis. Suburbs were not a new concept in London. As early as the Middle Ages, people had lived outside of the walls of the old city, but not very far outside. We've already heard how you get the Garden Square suburbs in the 18th and 19th century here to the west. And between 1750 and 1820, 5 new bridges had been opened across the River Thames, which had opened up South London to development. It led to the building of housing like this. This was for the skilled working class, manual labourers who could literally just walk across the bridge into their jobs north of the River Thames. For those wealthy enough to have access to private carriages, they could move much further into South London and built these rather fabulous villas in Camberwell, which is a bit of a distance from the river, but they were travelled by private coach. But what happens, of course, is that in the 18th and early 19th century, London's expansion is constrained by the lack of transport, because it's only the very wealthy that can afford to live this far out because they've got a private means of transport. Everyone else has to stay close enough to walk to work. As early as 1829, you get the opening of the first public bus route in London. And the year before Queen Victoria came to the throne, you get the first ever commuter railway line in the world. London's firsts continue. In 1863, you get this, the world's first underground railway. This is Baker Street Station, which is actually, the platforms are original from 1863, still used today. And though Baker Street is in the centre of London, from 1868, the Metropolitan line, which runs from Baker Street, pushed out into the countryside. And as it did so, houses are built around the Metropolitan line stations, just as they're built around these suburban railway stations, which were built right across London. Now, initially, this form of transport was relatively expensive. So the housing that's built around these railway stations and underground stations is very middle class. Things like these beautiful houses here, which are just next to Denmark Hill Station, which you've just seen. But 2 developments from 1870 onwards really allow the true suburbanisation of London. The first was the development of the horse-drawn tram. Now, trams run on rails, which allowed them to carry far more passengers than the old buses, and so the fares reduce. And trams rapidly become the transport of choice for the skilled working class. Tramways ran from South and East and North London into the centre. And so you get new suburbs developed 3 to 5 miles from the centre of London. And people travel by tram from there into the centre. In 1884, the chairman of London Tramways was able to boast, "We have relieved London of an immense number of poor people by carrying them out to the suburbs." A year earlier, it had become a legal requirement for train companies to offer what were known as workman's fares. Now, of course, trains could travel much faster and so much further out into the countryside, spreading the suburbanisation of London. But the effect was very uneven. In fact, while many Londoners became suburban in the 19th century, suburbs were very far from uniform. Location and other developments in the area really affected the wealth or otherwise of a particular suburb. Suburbs that were built close to industrial sites or on cheaper transport routes. This is a tram suburb that you can see here, or close to facilities which were considered undesirable, like being based too close to a lunatic asylum or a cemetery. Well, they could only attract working class residents. So those suburbs are built, as you can see, from cheaper building material, smaller housing designed for the working class. Other areas which were built as very wealthy suburbs, you can see the beautiful housing here in Pimlico, are abandoned by the middle classes. If a new transport route, which can be afforded by poorer people, was put in, then you'd get more working class residents and the middle classes would move out to suburbs further out of London. Pimlico is very central, and so many of the residents moved further out, meaning that these beautiful houses were subdivided for working class households. Just pre the Second World War, each of these houses had an average of 4 to 5 families living within them. Some suburbs, however, maintained their middle class status, either those that were a good distance from London, which took the residents away from the ever-present London pollution of the 19th century, or those with a real social cachet in the centre of London, like Kensington, which you can see on your screen here. Kensington has the connotations of Kensington Palace and its links to royalty, and the South Kensington district was created as a whole new cultural district in the later 19th century. So you can see by the end of the century that it is only attracting the wealthiest of middle class residents. What's interesting, though, is that the basic style of housing across all of these suburbs is the same. As I flick back through, you can see that all of these houses for different classes are what are known as terraced houses here in England. They're rows of houses which share external walls. So the status, the extra space of a property isn't by the amount of space that it's set in, it isn't by the footprint, it's by adding height and adding ornamentation to the building. And that's how Londoners would have seen the wealth of different suburbs, by how grand the terraced house was and whether it was subdivided between multiple families. Of course, not all Londoners could afford to move to the suburbs. The workmen's fares were only useful to the working classes in stable employment. For those who were in casual employment, where you turned up each day in the hope of work, well, they couldn't afford the fares if they didn't get work. So they had to stay close enough to their place of work to be able to walk. And for those left behind, the transport improvements of the 19th century actually made their lives significantly worse. And you get this terrible slum housing in London. It's estimated that 76,000 Londoners lost their homes in slums to railway developers in the second half of the 19th century, as slums are cleared for new railway lines and railway stations. And for those who couldn't afford to move to the suburbs, their only choice was to move into another, even more overcrowded slum. Despite suburbanisation, Victorian London continued to have significant slum housing, particularly in the industrial east and inner south and around the docks areas. But more surprisingly, there was actually slum housing dotted through the city, often on the edges of wealthy districts, because these were the workers that serviced those wealthy districts, wedged up against railway lines or crammed in to formerly wealthy housing, which had been subdivided as the middle classes had moved out. For most of the century, there were no official attempts to deal with slum housing. The dominant Victorian attitude towards poverty was not that it was a result of your economic circumstances of your birth or a lack of educational opportunities, but that poverty was a result of a deficiency on behalf of the poor person themselves. Poverty was inextricably linked in the Victorian mind with morality. Despite that, there were charitable attempts to improve housing for the poor from the 1840s onwards. And most famously, the charitable housing was led by a man called George Peabody, who was an American banker. In 1862, he set up the Peabody Donation Fund, and it built housing like the housing you can see on the screen here, right across the inner area of London, as did other housing charities. By the end of the 19th century, these charities had housed 80,000 people, which sounds like a lot, but if you think London's population was increasing by 80,000 people a year, charity couldn't hope to deal with the scale of the problem. It wasn't until the very end of the century, with changing attitudes, that you get the first public housing built for the poor in London. The early public housing looks like this. It's a very beautiful estate, but it was a very small start to tackling a very large problem. In fact, slum housing was not eradicated in London until the 1960s. But that Victorian decision to come to believe that providing housing for the poor was a role for the state was hugely significant. It only came at the very end of the era, but it meant in the 20th century, huge amounts of public housing was built in London. So much so that a quarter of London's population today still lives in that charitable and that public built housing. Now, most of London's development, of course, wasn't public. It was fueled by private investment, both the housing developers and the private transport companies. And so it was often very chaotic and unplanned. And it means that over time, the government realized it wasn't just in housing that the government had to intervene just to make the city work. It was a slow process. Britain had traditionally been a place of small government, low taxation, a belief that the market could solve problems and that people should rely on themselves, not on the state. But with rapid urbanisation, a problem for an individual becomes a problem for the whole city. And so, despite reluctance in addressing the problems of urbanisation, by the end of the century, government, both local and national, has a much bigger role in people's lives than previously. Of course, a chronic problem they had to address, as all city dwellers know, was traffic. And it's rather beautifully depicted in this picture here. New road schemes, many of them demolishing slum districts, were carried out throughout London by the state from 1855, and they shaped the city. Schemes such as Holborn Viaduct, which you can see here, are not only still part of the core road network in London, they're also pretty impressive architectural and engineering achievements. Most famous was the attempt to solve traffic congestion to the east of the central zone and the building of Tower Bridge by Sir Horace Jones in 1894. Now, this was a very practical solution to the problem of traffic flow between North and South London, but also to not block ships coming into the inner historic port. And of course, to achieve that, the bridge opens in the middle. And in doing so, it's become an icon of modern London, built by the Victorians. Another major driver for state intervention in the 19th century was fears over public health. London had suffered from cholera epidemics in 1832 and 1849, and there was a real fear of the spread of disease by miasma or bad smells. By the 1850s and 60s, the most pressing concern for wealthy Londoners was sewage. One of the greatest achievements of Victorian London, very rarely seen and astoundingly still used today, is the sewage system that was built by this man, Joseph Bazalgette, between 1858 and 1875. It's an absolutely massive system, and the main interceptor sewers ran alongside the River Thames. To get the space for that, the Thames was embanked, and that created not only the modern shape of the River Thames, but the land that was reclaimed was turned into new roads and gardens, as you can see here at Chelsea. To push the sewage eastwards, where it was dumped into the Thames away from the city, you had pumping stations. You can still see the Western pumping station in Chelsea today, and even more impressive, the Abbey Mills pumping station, which slightly bizarrely is known as the Cathedral of Sewage. It is a seriously impressive building. Further public health concerns lead to the opening of the first modern cemeteries in London from the 1840s. And to these, this is a public wash house, which was designed to encourage the poor of London to wash themselves and their clothes when they didn't have access to private bathrooms. It's a very mundane use for the building. But the buildings are often incredibly grand, expressing local pride. And just as this one, many of them had other public services attached. The building on the left of the picture is a public library, and huge numbers of public libraries are built in the Victorian period in London. They were run by local authorities, but they were largely funded by philanthropists. Famous in the United States, Andrew Carnegie funded several London libraries. But even more important to London was Passmore Edwards, and his name can still be seen on the outside of public libraries in London today. It was very much part of that Victorian philosophy of self-improvement through education. And working people would use these libraries to improve their lot and make up for a lack of formal education. So much so that this library, the Whitechapel Free Library, becomes known as the University of the Ghetto. Lots of people didn't have a formal education because for the first half of our period, the government simply didn't believe that the provision of education was part of their job. Now, there was charitable provision, but despite this, in 1869, it's estimated that 20% of the poorest Londoners had no access to education. Now, this changes in 1870. And again, it wasn't because of a sudden government belief to help the lot of the working classes. Again, it was based on fear. And it was based this time on the fear of falling behind, because there was a real concern in Britain that Britain was losing out to newer industrialized powers, particularly Germany and the United States. And it was felt that a better educated workforce was needed for Britain to keep its competitive edge. Following legislation, in 1870, the London School Board was created, which built and ran schools right across inner London. The style of their schools is incredibly distinctive. Their buildings can still be seen across inner London today, and they're still used as schools. This incredibly impressive building is an ordinary elementary school in my home district in London. Education and self-improvement were also central to the mission of the national cultural institutions that were either expanded or founded in London in the Victorian era. In the early years of Queen Victoria's reign, the National Gallery and the British Museum gained fabulous new homes. In South Kensington, as I mentioned, a completely new cultural district is built in the second half of the 19th century. So by the end of the century, it was home to the Natural History Museum, the Victorian Albert Museum, and the concert and exhibition space at the Royal Albert Hall. Elsewhere, a relaxation in legislation and, of course, a huge increase in population means the Victorian era is boom years for commercial theatre. In 1851, there were just 19 theatres in London. By 1899, so less than 50 years later, that had risen to 63. And they were found in London's new West End district, which is still our theatre district today, but also out in the suburbs. And they provided a huge range of viewing options, everything from serious Shakespeare to Dickens adaptations to music hall and melodrama, which was very popular with the working classes who could afford tickets, the better off working classes, for the first time. The sheer scale and range of developments in Victorian London left contemporaries struggling to put into words to explain and describe the new city they found themselves in. Even 100 years later, I found it very difficult to express all of these changes in a 30-minute lecture. But it was even more difficult for contemporaries to work out how to manage a city on a previously unprecedented scale. Now, most of the development in London had been privately funded, and philanthropy had provided a lot of the social provision during this era. But by the late 19th century, it had become clear to Londoners that London needed more than district government or centrally appointed boards. What it needed was an elected citywide government. In 1889, that government was created. The London County Council took responsibility for this area that you can see on the map. It's quite an expansion from the square mile, which you can just see sitting at the centre of it, which had been London at the beginning of the 19th century. In fact, the London County Council took responsibility for 117 square miles. It was a recognition of how far London had now spread. The London County Council took responsibility not for a city, but for a metropolis, for the largest city the world had ever seen. And the Victorians had truly made modern London. Thank you. And now it's time for questions.
Thank you very much, Ruth. That was wonderful. We can now start our Q&A session. And again, if you have a question for Ruth, you can submit it using the question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen. And we had a few questions come in during your presentation. So I'll kick us off with some of those. And one really interesting question came in from Mary. She asked, did Queen Victoria herself push for any reform that would help those who are working class? Did she have any push for that? Because I know you mentioned that the government made these decisions to build out of fear that they would fall behind. But what was Queen Victoria's role in this specifically?
So Queen Victoria herself didn't take a hugely directive government role. We're very much into the era of constitutional monarchy by the 19th century. But of course, there is an influencing role. And not so much Victoria, but her husband, Prince Albert, actually was very influential in terms of the development of London, particularly the South Kensington district, which is sometimes known as Albertopolis, because he was so involved in its development. And actually some of that was very much around bettering education for the working classes. One of the core aims of what's now called the Victoria and Albert Museum was to allow access to culture and knowledge and learning for the working classes. And so Albert did push that agenda. And it's very interesting that at the Great Exhibition, which Albert sponsored in 1851, one of the exhibits was model working class housing. And you can actually see the model working class house, which was a fully built size house, which would house 4 families, is now on display in one of the London parks.
Wow. And that's interesting to hear his role in all of this, because I'm seeing a lot of questions come in specifically about his role, about Albert's role in this. Sounds like he took on a very, very large one. And we have a question from Shirley, who asks, were the middle class families able to purchase their homes, or were they renting them? What was that setup like? Could they own their homes?
It's a really, really good question, and very, very different from the modern day. Middle class families did largely or did start to own their homes, though not all of them. But it is a very small percentage. It's thought that in 1900, about 10% of homes are owned in London. You're probably looking at a middle class population of about 25%. So maybe half, a little under half of middle class families are owning their homes. No working class family is owning their home. But it was seen as a sign of status within the middle class to be a home owner. Those homes in Pimlico, the beautiful ones that then go downhill, one of the things that was said about Pimlico is, well, it's not as good as Belgravia, but it is part of the home owning area of London. And that was seen as a status thing.
Okay. And kind of tying into all of this reform and social change, there had to have been a reaction, maybe a religious reaction from the Church of England. Although I guess they're kind of connected, right, with Queen Victoria and the Church of England. But was there a religious effort to create reform for the working class families?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And the Church of England is a huge institution it's a huge institution in Britain today. It was a huge institution in 19th century London, but it was, I think it's not unfair to say, a declining institution. Even by 1850, when we had our first religious census, which I think is really, really interesting in the 1851 census, actually they discovered that more than half of people weren't going to church at all. And of the people who were going to church, less than half were going to Church of England churches. So you see quite a religious diversity. You've got the Methodist movement, the Baptist movement. You've got increasing numbers of Roman Catholics, largely with Irish immigration, which came with industrialization. So the religious picture is quite diverse, actually, interestingly, in Victorian London. So the Church of England, but other churches actually did take a role in social change. It wasn't regarded as quite proper by everyone in the Church of England. So there was opposition to the Church of England being too hands-on, but there was a movement within the church, an evangelical movement, which was very much about going out and working in poor communities and providing social provision within poor communities. You get, at the very end of the period, something called the settlement movement. And many of those were church-driven, middle class, largely graduates, moving into houses in working class areas and working with the working class. And a lot of that's religiously driven. And pre-1870, the largest provider of education in London was the Church of England.
Okay. And Karen asks, kind of hopping off of that, Karen asks, was the development of hospitals and healthcare similar to that development of education in that early government attitude that was, not our job? How did that come about and when?
It's a really, really good question. So one of the areas I didn't cover, because it kind of predates the Victorian period, is what's known as the Poor Laws. So the old Poor Law dates back to 1601, and it basically made the parishes of London, which is it's a geographical unit of the church, but it becomes the geographical unit of local government, responsible for looking after the poor. And one of the things that they do is very famously associated with Dickens, with Oliver Twist, is they run workhouses for those who are unable to work. Now, nobody who could even hope to get work would go into a workhouse. They were deliberately designed to be worse than the worst conditions outside, to discourage people from taking these state benefits. So workhouses are largely filled with the long-term infirm, with the very elderly, and with orphaned children, or women who'd got pregnant outside of wedlock. Now, of course, amongst those groups, you've got very big healthcare needs. And so you get workhouse infirmaries, which are attached to the workhouse. And in the 1860s, there is huge pressure from social reformers, Florence Nightingale, very famous as the founder of modern nursing, and also, weirdly, Louisa Twining, who is of the Twining's tea dynasty, was a big social campaigner for healthcare.
Okay.
And they actually force the government to change legislation so that parishes have to provide separate infirmaries to the workhouse. And they're then opened up to all the working class. And that's the origins of a state healthcare system in London. And that's from the 1880s, we have the origins of a state healthcare system. The middle class, the more wealthier working classes had access to what were known as voluntary hospitals. So these were charitable endeavours, but you had to pay a little bit. Mm-hmm. And for the middle class and the wealthy, you're still very much looking at being treated in your own home.
Okay. And Catherine had a really good question. What motivated private individuals, these philanthropists, to take up this private development? Like someone who, like Andrew Carnegie, who's an American, what motivated them to do that?
See, Andrew Carnegie is either an American or a Scot, depending on which way you look at it.
Yes, depending where you come from.
For the Scots, he's definitely a Scot.
Yeah.
And he Carnegie himself went to visit a library somewhere in the States and was absolutely blown away by the potential that it had to change working class lives. And so he funds libraries in the States and in this country. Passmore Edwards, who's the other big library pioneer in this country, had actually come from a very modest background himself, had made his fortune in journalism and newspaper ownership. And he wanted to give something back, but he was also, I think, that awareness that there would be hugely talented poor children like himself who weren't getting the access. And so that driver is this Victorian middle class ideal of self-improvement, of taking responsibility yourself, but this recognition that people needed opportunities to take responsibility, which museums, which libraries provided. In the housing terms, there was a slight profit return for those building housing for the poor. It was nothing to the kind of profits that could be made if they built houses for the rich, which provided massive returns during the 19th century. But it was known as 5% philanthropy. So the investors who put forward money, partly through philanthropy, they were offered a 5% return from the rents from this charitable housing that was built. So I think people had a huge different range of reasons. And I think religion was very important to a lot of those people in terms of this belief in a care for fellow man.
Okay, great. Thank you. That brings me to a question. We have a viewer named Jay Weinstein asks, you mentioned that there's public housing today. Over a fourth or a 1/4 of your population lives in public housing. So what was the process of converting maybe these London slums into public housing, and are there still slums that exist, or how was that transition past this Victorian era?
So you get the first real surge in public house building, although it starts with the Victorians. There's a real surge in the aftermath of the First World War, in the interwar period. They were known as homes fit for heroes. This real horror that people who'd served for Britain on the Western Front in the First World War would then come back and live in slum housing. And so that's the real government driver under the 1919 Housing Act to make it easier for local authorities to build housing. There is a big leap forward in that period. There's an even bigger leap forward in the period 1945 to 1979. And so most of the public housing in London today does date from that era. And that's generated by two things. One of which, of course, is the destruction of the Blitz. Many of these slum houses are bombed during the Second World War. And they're not just slums anymore, they're virtually demolished. This is particularly the case in the Docks district of London because the Docks were a strategic target. So local authorities take on responsibility for rebuilding those homes rather than leaving it to private development. And they combined that, once you've got these shiny new housing estates, as we call them, with then you'd still have pockets of slums. So they then go through a slum clearance process. And that was pretty much completed by the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s. So there are no Victorian slums in London today. In fact, it was incredibly difficult, actually, even to get the photo of the lower working class housing, because that has largely disappeared in slum clearance programs of the 20th century.
Okay, wow. And we have questions coming in about the actual illustrations that you were using from. Yeah. We're wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the artist's illustrations, Gustave Doré.
Gustave Doré. And he worked with a writer called Gerald, and they produced this Londoner Pilgrimage, which is referenced on there, which I would firmly recommend people look up. It has been criticised. Doré didn't like sketching outdoors. So a lot of it was walking through London and then going home and drawing from memory. So they have very much been criticised as not being entirely accurate representations of Victorian London and particularly Victorian poverty. But the book is a wonderful, I think, snapshot of Victorian London. And I use the pictures of poor districts because I can't go out and photograph them because they no longer exist. But in fact, London A Pilgrimage covers all social classes. So it's got wealthy people going out to Ascot, and it's got balls and things like that. So it was designed to provide this insight into London in 1872 of all of the different classes out and about.
Okay. And I think we have time for one more question. And this has been a question that's rolled in a few times now, so I think it's a pretty hot one we want to answer. You mentioned Dickens for a moment earlier, and those who are watching are wondering, did his writing, did his stories have a great influence on this reform that took place that created this system for the working class and poor families?
So it's a really interesting, and it's very, very difficult to put a definitive answer on it. Dickens was certainly one of a whole movement of people who really do prick the consciences of the people with the power to change things in London. Dickens isn't the only novelist who's involved in this. Arthur Morrison's Child of the Iago is actually a much, much more brutal account. Oliver Twist, in the end, gets to move in with the rich family. The protagonist of Child of the Iago is brutally murdered in a street fight aged about 16. And that was a bit more of a realistic portrayal of what was likely to be the results for these children. But I think the combination of all of those, of Dickens and other writers, but also the Victorians had a real passion for statistics. They thought statistics were really exciting. And so you get bestsellers that are statistical studies. Edwin Chadwick is the early pioneer. And then towards the end of the period, you have Charles Booth's Life and Labour, which produces these very famous color-coded maps. And again, these are bestsellers. People are fascinated by this. So yes, I think Dickens does make a difference. He's by far the most prominent of the writers, but I think it is a rising tide of a combination of different writers, artists, statisticians, who it all kind of generate this changing attitude.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that is all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for giving us more information about London and how it came to be specifically in the Victorian era. I want to thank you, our expert today, Ruth Polling, for your presentation.
Thank you.
And we'll welcome you back for a virtual field trip to Kensington next month. So any of you who are interested in that, please check our website in the coming weeks so that you can register for Ruth's virtual field trip to Kensington. And a big thank you to all of you for joining us today and asking your questions. And should you wish to donate to Rhodes Scholar, again, the link to do so is www.rhodesscholar.org/give. And we'll see you all next time. Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you so much. Thank you.